What if the biggest warning sign in a war never makes a sound? What if it looks like nothing at all, just empty water where ships used to be? If you want to catch these warnings before the news does, hit subscribe right now, tap that like button, and send this to one person who still thinks wars only show up as explosions on a screen, because something did just disappear from the water near Iran's coast. Not a building, not a ship that got hit, just space. Empty space where dozens of tankers used to sit, waiting their turn to load oil. And the people who study that water for a living say this exact kind of disappearance has shown up before, right before something big happened. Let's slow down and understand where this is even happening, because the location matters more than people realize. There is a small island off the coast of Iran called Kharg Island. It is tiny. You could scroll past it on a map 100 times and never notice it. But this one small island does something enormous. It handles the vast majority of Iran's crude oil exports. Almost all the money that keeps Iran's government running flows through the water around this island. Every tanker that leaves loaded with oil from Kharg is carrying part of a nation's income with it. So when something strange happens near Kharg Island, it is never just a shipping story. It is a story about money, about power, and right now, about a war. Here's what actually happened. Satellite firms that track ocean traffic noticed that a large amount of empty tanker capacity near Kharg simply vanished. These were ships with nothing on board, sitting there as backup capacity, ready in case they were needed, and then without warning, without any announcement, they were gone. Not sunk, not seized, just moved out quickly, all at once. To understand why that matters, you have to understand how these tracking firms actually work, because none of this is guesswork. Companies like Windward use satellites that combine several types of technology together. Radar that can detect the metal hull of a ship, even if its tracking signal is switched off. Optical images that can literally show you the ship sitting on the water. And thermal readings that can pick up the heat coming off an engine. Put all of that together, and you get a picture of the ocean that is very hard to hide from, even for a government that badly wants to hide. That is why this detection matters so much. When ships suddenly leave an area they were previously happy to sit in, it usually means somebody with information gave a quiet order. Somebody expected trouble. And in the past, this exact type of pattern, empty tankers pulling out of that same stretch of water, happened shortly before Kharg Island was actually struck. Ships with nothing to lose left first. The ones still loading stayed, because leaving mid-loading would have been far more suspicious and far more costly. So when this same pattern reappears, people who watch this water for a living do not shrug it off. They sit up straight. Now, if you are new here and you want more stories like this one, stories built on real tracking data instead of guesses, go ahead and subscribe, because these patterns keep repeating, and I want you seeing them before they turn into headlines. Let's talk about what has actually been confirmed on the ground, because this is not a theory. This is a live, ongoing situation. Earlier this year, the United States carried out a major strike on Kharg Island itself, hitting more than 90 military sites while trying to avoid destroying the oil infrastructure directly. Iran said explosions rocked the island for nearly 2 hours. That strike was aimed at the military assets Iran was using to threaten shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important oil routes on the entire planet. Then, after a short period of diplomacy and a temporary understanding between the United States and Iran, things fell apart again. Iran began attacking commercial vessels moving through the strait. The ceasefire collapsed, and the United States reinstated a full naval blockade on Iranian ports. This is where it stops being background history and becomes something happening right now. Under this blockade, any Iranian vessel or any vessel suspected of carrying goods for Iran can be stopped, boarded, searched, and seized. Just one day after that blockade went back into effect, the U.S. military disabled an oil tanker that was heading toward Kharg Island. The ship had been warned repeatedly to stop. It did not. A U.S. aircraft fired directly into the ship's smokestack to disable it without sinking it. The tanker never reached Iran. That single event tells you everything about the stakes here. This is not a symbolic blockade. Ships are actually being fired on. Tankers are actually being turned back or destroyed mid-journey. And underneath all of that pressure, Iran is still trying to move its oil, because that oil is the lifeline funding everything else the country is doing during this war. This is exactly why the disappearing ships matter so much. Every barrel of oil that manages to slip through the blockade becomes part of a much bigger fight, a fight that is happening quietly in the water, away from cameras, away from headlines, away from almost everyone's attention. Let's go a level deeper, because the way Iran is trying to move this oil is genuinely remarkable, in a disturbing kind of way. Every large commercial ship is supposed to broadcast its location constantly using a system called AIS. It is meant to prevent collisions and keep shipping lanes safe. Turning that signal off is called going dark. On its own, going dark is not automatically illegal. Sometimes signals drop for innocent reasons, but when it happens again and again in a war zone near a blockaded coastline, it almost never means something innocent. Tracking firms have recorded dozens of ships going dark near this coastline at the same time, then briefly reappearing together, only to vanish again a couple of days later. That kind of synchronized disappearing act is not an accident. Ships do not coincidentally lose signal in groups. This is coordinated behavior, planned and repeated by an entire fleet trying to avoid detection. One clear example makes this easier to picture. A tanker left an anchorage, went dark, and disappeared from tracking completely for over a week. During that gap, it quietly met another tanker out at sea and transferred cargo between them, ship to ship, completely off the record. Then it reappeared on public tracking again, loaded with Iranian crude, heading right back toward the same route it had vanished from in the first place. That is not one strange trip. Multiple tankers have been recorded doing almost the exact same thing, sometimes on the very same day, all reaching a certain area, and then all going dark together, almost like flipping a switch on command. This tells you something important. This is not a handful of nervous ship captains making individual choices under pressure. This is an organized operation run at the scale of an entire national shipping fleet, built specifically to keep oil moving despite an active blockade trying to stop it. If this kind of detail is the kind of thing that keeps you thinking about a story long after the video ends, that is exactly the kind of storytelling I want to keep bringing you. So hit that subscribe button, and if you have not liked the video yet, now is a great moment to do it, because we are only halfway through the most important part. Now here is something that goes even further than simply switching off a tracking signal, and it is honestly one of the more unsettling details in this entire story. Reports describe a newer technique where ships do not just go dark. They actively broadcast fake location data. The tracking signal keeps running, showing the ship sitting quietly at anchor, behaving normally, doing nothing suspicious at all, except the ship is not actually there. It is somewhere else entirely, loading oil at Kharg Island the whole time, while its signal tells anyone watching a completely different story. Read that carefully, because it matters. This is not simply hiding. This is manufacturing a false picture on purpose, feeding fabricated information directly into the same systems that are supposed to keep global shipping honest and trackable. That is a level of sophistication far beyond just flipping a switch and hoping nobody notices. It shows planning. It shows technical skill. And it shows just how much pressure this blockade is actually putting on Iran's ability to sell its oil, because you do not build tools this elaborate unless the alternative is losing something you desperately need to keep. Now widen the picture even further, because Kharg Island is not the only choke point involved in this story. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important shipping routes in the world. A massive share of the planet's oil moves through it. At the same time, there is another narrow passage far away called the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, near the entrance to the Red Sea. Reports describe both of these narrow waterways being effectively shut down to tanker traffic at the same moment. That is genuinely rare. Two major global choke points closing together does not happen by accident. It forces oil shipments to take dramatically longer paths, sometimes rerouting thousands of extra miles just to avoid the areas under the tightest watch. Every extra mile is a cost. Every extra day at sea is more fuel, more risk, and more chances for a tanker to be spotted by exactly the kind of satellite tracking we have been talking about this whole time. And the danger in these waters is not some abstract, distant idea. International maritime organizations have recorded dozens of separate incidents involving commercial vessels across the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Gulf of Oman since this conflict escalated. Maritime safety assessments have placed the threat level in the Strait of Hormuz at the highest possible rating, citing ongoing attacks, the boarding of commercial ships, drone activity, and constant surveillance of shipping traffic in the region. That is the real environment behind every single dark tanker in this story. Not a quiet backdrop, one of the most dangerous stretches of commercial water on the planet right now, today. Let's step back for a second and talk about why any of this actually matters beyond ships and satellites and technical jargon, because it is easy to get lost in tanker names and lose sight of the human weight sitting underneath all of it. Oil revenue from Kharg Island is not just business. It is fuel for an entire government during an active war. Every barrel that makes it past the blockade is money that keeps flowing into a country currently fighting on more than one front. Every tanker that gets stopped, boarded, or disabled is pressure tightening just a little further. Every disappearing act, every fake location, every ship going dark is part of a much larger struggle over who controls that money and how long this war can be financially sustained. This is why analysts do not treat these disappearances lightly. A gap in shipping data is never just a gap. It is a signal about decisions being made behind closed doors, decisions that ordinary people never get to see directly, but that ripple outward into fuel prices, into military strategy, and into how long this conflict can realistically continue. If a story like this, one built on real tracking data instead of guesswork, is something you want to keep following, make sure you are subscribed, because these patterns tend to repeat, and I plan on catching every single one of them as they happen. Now let's be completely honest about what is solid fact here and what is still uncertain, because that honesty matters just as much in a story about satellites as it does in any other kind of reporting. It is confirmed that a major strike hit Kharg Island earlier this year, targeting military infrastructure while trying to spare the oil terminals themselves. It is confirmed that the United States reinstated a full naval blockade on Iranian ports after diplomacy collapsed. It is confirmed that a tanker was disabled at sea for trying to break that blockade just one day after it was reinstated. It is confirmed through independent satellite tracking that groups of tankers have gone dark together, reappeared together, and in some cases conducted secret transfers of cargo at sea before returning to their normal routes. What is less certain is exactly what any single disappearance means in isolation. A ship going dark could be part of a coordinated evasion effort. It could also just be a nervous captain being cautious during an active war. Not every gap in the data is a warning sign of something enormous about to happen. The historical pattern where empty ships fled before an actual strike is genuinely notable, but it is not a guarantee that repeats identically every single time. It is a pattern worth watching closely, not a crystal ball. So here is what actually matters going forward if you want to understand where this is heading, rather than just react to the next headline that shows up. Watch whether tracking firms report another sudden complete emptying of backup shipping capacity near Kharg Island specifically, because that narrow specific pattern is what mattered before, not simply general dark fleet activity, which has almost become routine at this point in the war. Watch whether actual loaded departures from the terminal suddenly drop, rather than just watching how many ships are sitting nearby with their signals switched off. A real halt in exports tells you far more than ships quietly waiting with nothing moving. Watch whether this fake location spoofing technique starts showing up at other Iranian ports beyond Kharg, because a tactic this sophisticated, once it works well in one place, tends to spread rather than stay limited to a single location. And watch the status of both major choke points, Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb. If either one starts easing back open, even partially, that tells you something concrete about tension actually decreasing. No single tanker's movement can tell you that on its own. The choke points can. None of these four signals guarantees exactly what happens next, but tracked consistently by people who understand what a normal baseline actually looks like, they form something close to a genuine early warning system, hidden inside data that almost nobody bothers to look at closely. One last thing worth saying clearly, because a story built this heavily on satellite data and shipping records deserves full transparency about where it comes from. Firms that track this water for a living have paying clients, governments, insurers, shipping companies who depend directly on that data being accurate. That gives these firms a strong incentive to get it right rather than exaggerate it for attention, because a client who loses money acting on a bad call simply stops paying for that firm's information. At the same time, some organizations that publicize this kind of tracking are built specifically around highlighting sanctions evasion, so their framing should be read with that focus in mind. Still, the specific ship names, dates, and movements they publish are the kind of detail that is far harder to fabricate than a vague claim. And other outlets checking the same public satellite data can, and do, verify those details independently. Something really did disappear from the water near Iran's coastline. real ships, real cargo capacity, made deliberately invisible, using increasingly advanced methods in the middle of an active, ongoing war. And the people watching the satellites noticed almost instantly, even while the rest of the world scrolled right past it, because it never came with an explosion or a dramatic press conference to announce itself. That is exactly why it deserves your attention. Not because it is loud, but because it is quiet. And in a war, quiet is often where the real decisions are being made. The ocean does not lie the way people do. It simply goes empty and waits for someone paying close enough attention to notice exactly what that emptiness is trying to say. If you made it this far, you already understand something most people watching the news tonight will completely miss. So do not stop here. Stay subscribed, keep watching the quiet signals with me, and when the next disappearance shows up in the data, you will already know exactly what it means long before anyone else does.